fundamental question you have to be answering at the end of the debate is how and what we can do for indigenous survival. What I mean by indigenous survival is epistemological, physical, emotional, and cosmological survival of indigenous life, which is seeing the interconnectedness of our life at the wholeness. Extend our lower to do it evidence. It talks specifically about how indigenous survival is inherently tied to our relationship to the land and our language. Focusing on the land reveals important gaps between Western and traditional knowledges that say how we see these relationships to land. All my elders say that it is the land that holds all knowledge of life and earth, and it is a constant teacher. It is the land that is key to our survival, and that they're not starting at a position of land, then they're automatically starting at a Western position. This is the specific dissent that we're putting, that we place into their criticism that they're not answering. You extend the Rodriguez evidence that they're conceding the world is genocide. The exceptional normal of genocidal proto social logic is the academy. The academy is never home for us. For us, we are always subject to genocide. We are always subject to eviction. It is always working structurally against us. This means that this is going to be an a priori issue. He never made any arguments to this specific piece of evidence because we are already being actively genocided. The indigenous life, it should be a prerequisite, should be viewed at first because this life is already not valued now. And the question you should be answering at the end of the debate is how close the alternative, how really it's about indigenous survival, how not only Vito and I to learn how to survive in the world, can survive in these spaces that are already desecrated spaces of sacred land, an issue that they're fundamentally dropping in terms of the alternative, in terms of the criticism debate, and also how our ancestors and these spiritual kinds of knowledges can live throughout this world that is constantly genociding it and working in terms of secular spirituality that is constantly divesting it and not studying in the issue of land, putting other issues at the forefront. Indigenous survival, the main link arguments that they have are these. Oh, I found it. The main arguments that they have is first the blind spot argument, but they are pretty much dropping all of our pieces of evidence that we're reading, that we read on the ableism flow. I'm going to actually go through this because I think it's a pretty important part of this debate. The Makisha evidence talks about the dehumanizing process must include the destruction of physical, emotional, psychic, economic, and cultural life. Appropriation of the land of indigenous peoples is a particularly important part of the disabling process. The impacts of colonial consolidation of land into large plantations dominated by single crops destroy the previous diverse and sustainable way of life and reduce the population to a humbling set of economic and psychosocial dependencies, which is to say that indigenous people are already at a disabled disadvantage. We have a different orientation to disablement that exists outside of the Western understandings of knowledge. The process of colonization is a disabling process that already puts us as disabled positions inside this world. This is a fundamental question that they're not answering. The Western differentiation between chronic illness and permanent disability cannot usefully explain the lived experiences of indigenous people. This goes back to the fundamental question that is what we do for indigenous survival that the alternative is not answering for, that only the affirmative can actually engage with. The analysis of the experience of disabled people, the concept of the establishment of a new social order of exile and colonized people ruled over by the British, French, or Spanish regime requires a different set of methodologies and frameworks than those formulated in the Northern Metropole, which is to say this, we need to be able to start from an indigenous perspective of knowledge because we have a different orientation to disablement. Not only are we colonized, but we're constantly actively disabled because we are genocided. This means that we are an a priori issue to anything that they are trying to and to any of the impacts that they're trying to weigh against. And the second Makisha piece of evidence talks about the new disability studies has emerged out of the Northern Metropole, is now being imported and exported to the Southern Metropole without reference to the work of Southern disability theorists and colonialism paved the way for disabling people in the global South, which this is a really important part against all of their authors that were criticizing theirs is a dissent to their kind of education, because our Lawrence and Dewitt piece of evidence talks about how the distinction between Western knowledge and indigenous knowledge is the fundamental relationship to land. All of their authors are specifically talking about the Northern Metropole, and it doesn't view how their theorization causes disablement and causes the colonization of the indigenous person. This is why he said that he tries to weigh these arguments about ableism comes first, but he's failing to acknowledge the fact that there are disabled indigenous people out there. When we're viewing the world in this terms of frame, we're viewing the world in a frame of genocide, then we have to think about indigenous survival. We have to think about these already disabled people who are literally physically disabled but also spiritually disabled. If you can't solve for the indigenous person that is disabled that exists in the Southern Metropole that your authors aren't acknowledging for, then you vote out. There's the only reason is to vote out for indigenous survival. They're not answering this question. You are dropping this language just that we're having to your ableism, the language trend that we have that talks about how the language that we're talking about in this round is a genocidal language. You're trying to correct us in your own language, but you don't realize that your correction is already a genocidal act, because correcting us in your language, you don't see how language can be genocide as be our genocide, which is a dissent to the alternative and a net benefit to the affirmative, because we are the only ones dealing with indigenous survival. Our Lawrence and Deal piece about it is pretty specific about how language is key to our survival. Language is key to our relationship to the land. Also, this means that the fact that we're even speaking in English in this round is already a genocide, is already the materiality of genocide. This is why the impact comes first. Yeah, they're not answering the Makisha disads, which is a dissad to the alternative. The alternative cannot cope with indigenous survival. Not only does the alternative not cope with indigenous survival, but is active in the colonization of indigenous people and the disablement of them. You should call for these pieces of evidence at the end of the round because they're actually pretty good on the question that they fail to answer. And they said that our revolution is not going to be accessible. We are not a revolution. We don't really give a fuck about coalitions. The only question you have to answer about in this debate round is who does the best for indigenous survival. The affirmative is the only way because we already framed it in terms. Our Lums do a piece of evidence is talking about our relationships to land, healing that spirituality, resisting in terms of the unacceptable norm of this debate round. The world that already genocides us is key to being able to survive. We change the framework of ableism. This is why you are only opposing. This is another disaster alternative. They're imposing Western colonial ideologies onto us. We exist outside of the framework of Western ideologies unless any of their links are specific to indigeneity and indigenous knowledge. Then they are only subsuming us into the colonial world. And